Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Marilyn Shannon, and this is the Breaking Free Show, and I'm so happy you're all here to join us today. Feel free anytime during our show to call in anytime you want. You can join us in our chat. Just put your name, nickname, whatever you like under the video, and you'll be in our live chat, and you can comment and ask questions in there. You can always call in to 919-518-9773. Or you can come in on Skype, and that would be Skype voice, not video, and that would be at computers at 2K voice, okay? So here we go. I'm going to say hi to Amnon.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
I'm doing well.
I love your hair.
I love my hair, too. I hope you all notice. For those of you that, see us each week, I've gotten red, and I love it. It's like wearing a new pair of glasses, and I am in heaven. So it's good.
Yep.
Anyway, we're going to get on with our show. It's going to be lovely. We're going to have a wonderful conversation today with Zahra, and we're going to be talking about all kinds of things. So let me introduce her to you now. Hey, Zahra, welcome.
Hi, Marilyn.
How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm good. Nice to see you again.
Yes, likewise. Nice to see you.
And happy holidays.
Thank you. You too.
My pleasure. So tell us about you.
Tell us about me.
Yes.
So I am an assistant professor of religion at Dartmouth College, and I study gender and Islamic ethics and sort of Muslim feminisms as well, and ethical thought within Muslim feminist texts and movements, and sort of also Islam broadly speaking.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So what does it mean to be a feminist and to be studying feminine? What does that mean to you, and what are you teaching?
I love this question.
Oh, good. You had it before?
Yeah, I
Good.
love it. What does it mean to be a Muslim feminist and to teach Muslim femininity, I guess, or Muslim feminism rather, in the university setting it's a really interesting space to be in, because so to be a Muslim feminist, obviously it's really just it's a very sort of simple definition would be to say to believe that women are human beings, right? Just sort of very basic definition. To believe in gender equality, and then having to be Muslim. Being an Islamic feminist is a related kind of issue. It's a related thing. Somebody who believes that from within the Islamic tradition, there is strong support for gender equality. And so, and that's, within the Islamic tradition, I mean Islamic texts, Islamic history, and so on. Mm-hmm. And I suppose I'm both. And I teach in the university setting and at Dartmouth College. I teach courses on gender and Islamic thought in the Islamic tradition, in texts and movements, and then so masculinity, femininity, sexuality, and gender relations, and then and I also teach Muslim feminist discourses as well. So Muslim movements, and so I guess the material that falls under the study of gender in Islam is different from the material that falls under Muslim feminist thought and Muslim feminist movements, but there are obviously overlaps, since it's the study of feminism, or is the study of is the feminist perspectives that sort of unlock the whole field of studying gender within the Islamic tradition.
Yeah, because it's not always what we hear. That's why we need you to tell us. Right?
Yeah,
so,
it's not something that a lot of people are familiar with until they either take courses or they encounter Muslim women and in their lives, and then they it's yeah. So.
Well, yeah, and I want to know more. So here's a question on our chat, okay? And this is from Iman. My question for the guest is one of her mythology. What made her put these three ethicists in conversation with one another? And how did examining masculinity inform her gendered analytic?
Oh, I think this is somebody who has read my book. So my book is actually, I have it here. Is Gendered Morality,
Hold it,
classical.
yeah, hold it up a little. Okay,
Hold
great.
hold on, like this. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's gendered morality, classical Islamic ethics of the self, family, and society. And so it's published by Columbia University Press this past few months. I guess this over the summer or this past summer.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
You're
Thank you.
welcome.
And so yeah, so this person definitely has read my book, so she's asking what made me study the particular ethics texts and ethical figures that I do in the book. And basically, the book is sort of like a feminist critique of the Islamic ethics tradition, which is basically one genre of Islamic thought, classical, like medieval Islamic thought.
Which is what? Just tell us what that is and then tell us where you take it.
Yeah, sure. So the medieval Islamic thought is like, there's all these genres. There's Islamic law, there's Islamic ethics, Islamic philosophy, there's mysticism. There are all these different genres and of writing that you encounter in the Islamic tradition. And I take up Islamic ethics texts, which are basically like philosophy-based texts. And if anyone's familiar with Aristotle or Plato, well, these texts that I'm working on in this that I worked on for this book are very, very similar in that they're sort of based on Aristotelian philosophy and Platonic philosophy. And so, the texts are basically about how to refine yourself as a human being, how to approach life, the question of how to live, what's the ethical way of life, an ethical way of living, what is human responsibility towards the self, towards the family, towards your society. It really answers the question of how do you live as an individual, how do you live in a family, and how do you live as a part of a society, right? And so what I do in the book is actually I'm looking at how these texts that talk about all these questions and stuff, how they actually construct gender while doing it, right? So like the texts that, as I find in my book, they're primarily, the audience is men, right? So like elite, learned, philosophically minded men who are reading these things, and the ethicists that I talk about in the book, they're basically talking to men about how to be ethical men. And in that process, they'll talk about, how to be a good husband, how to be a good father, what do you do, how to be a good friend, a good employee, even if you want to think of employee or like, subordinate or whatever, work, and how to be a boss. And so they're thinking about all of these things from a male perspective for men, right? They're guidelines for men. And so I'm coming in and asking, well, what about women, right? How are women figuring in these texts? Like, how are they treated? And I'm asking the question of, well, if these texts are for men and by men and for men, right? So what kind of access to ethical life do women have then in this world? Or if our ethics text today, or ethical thought today is largely built on this same tradition of Aristotelian Platonic thought, and the figures that I talk about in my book are, for those of you who want to know, are Al-Ghazali and Nasiruddin Tusi and Davani. So these figures, if so much of current philosophical thought is like built upon this, foundation, then, then some of the issues that we find in these medieval texts with regard to gender still kind of exist, even in our current philosophy, current modern day philosophical ethics. So that's the critique. That's what I'm going for in the book, asking those questions. And
what are some of your answers, though?
What are some of my answers is really, that I don't know if I answer so much as problematize, but I definitely, one of the things that the questioner asked was, what happens when you talk about masculinity, right, in these texts, which is what I pull out a lot of, right, because they're by and for men. And so what happens when you focus on masculinity in the text is you kind of get a sense of, well, how are men how are men being told how to be, right, as men, how to construct, how masculinity is constructed, you know, and in a moral ethical perspective. And is it really moral and ethical if masculinity, or like being ethical, relies on having to utilize others or subjugate others or whatever, right? So how ethical is that really? So I guess I come answers, if you want to call them answers, is that like I basically identify certain points of of issues, that certain issues that really we need to deeply philosophically engage with today, right? So I guess I can name three right now. So one would be utilization of others, right? So like when you want to be a moral and ethical person, right? If that morality and that ethics happens to require that you, use other people while doing it, right? Use other people, meaning utilize people for, whether it's, whether it's, say, for example, you're a man who requires a spouse to stay at home, to take care of your children and your responsibilities and clean your home and so on. And say that woman chooses that's great. But say there's just not that much choice involved, right? Then you're really putting that person in a sort of an exploitative kind of relationship, right? And you're kind of utilizing that person to get to that ends of your loftier goals of improving yourself, maybe perhaps it's pursuing an education or it's writing, or even, going to work to help other people. If you're not necessarily introspectively helping your loved ones, then you're putting them in an exploitative position,
Right.
So that's like an example. Another would be like human responsibility. Like, what's our human responsibility is one of the things I talk about in the book a lot, right? It's like, well, if we are supposed to be, like, it's like the perennial question of like, how are we supposed to live? What are the kinds of things that come under the standard, the rubric of human responsibility, right? And by that I mean, like, what are our responsibilities towards ourselves and our families and our communities? And we really need to sort of think through that and ask that question, because so much of human responsibility is like paternalistic. It's like, being thinking for other people, some people thinking and acting like they know best for others. And that's really problematic, because even though you feel responsible for other people, how do you do that in a way that's not paternalistic? Or, how do you do that in a way, how do you hold yourself accountable and responsible for other people without actually thinking for them or knowing or acting like you know better,
Right.
So that's another major sort of issue that I identify in the book that we need to think through about. And then one is a very sort of basic issue, which is defining humanity, right? So the Platonic and Aristotelian tradition defines humanity, of which the Islamic philosophical ethics that I work through is a part of that, right? That tradition defines humanity as like, human being is like the rational animal, right? It's the thinking and rational animal compared to all the other animals and beings on this planet. The human being is the rational one, right? And that's fine, and that's a lot, gives you a lot of mileage in terms of, okay, well, that's kind of nice, right? Like, you're thinking about being rational, being a thinking being, and what does being a thinking being actually mean? And it provides a lot of thoughtfulness around
Right.
human action and like what you do and how you act.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem with that is that when you define the human being as the thinking animal, then you get into a situation in which the the people who are defining who is the thinking, who are the thinking people, right? And whose rationality are we talking about?
Right.
And oftentimes you'll hear this a lot, right, Marilyn, is that women are emotional and they're not rational, and that's why we can't have women leaders because they're emotional, and men are rational, and like that approach, is basically like cutting off women from rationality. And if women are not rational on the one hand, and you're at the same time defining human beings as the rational animal, then are women not human? Right? Like,
Right.
of course women are human, right? So like that, when I started off at the beginning, when you asked me, what does it mean to be Islamic feminist or Muslim feminist? It's a very simple definition of like, women are human beings, just that.
Right.
It's really because women are cut off from humanity through this idea that, they're not as mentally sophisticated. They don't have the capacity to do and be, fine.
So there's a lot of questions I have for you. But
Okay.
The first question I have is, how did you begin all of this? What made you travel this path? What made you want to be the person who comes out into the world and shifts it, or helps us question these things? Where did you start with your thinking?
Where did I start? I mean, I suppose I was like a little feminist from childhood, but I think where it really began for me was really thinking through the idea of society, like socially, just encountering a lot of, we talked about this a moment ago, which was, the idea that, people don't really hear a lot about this, right? That people don't really hear about Muslim feminists or anything, right? And so, like, me being a Muslim woman, just like others encountering me and me having to explain who I am over and over again in my life, it was helped me sort of introspectively think about, well, what's my place in this in society, right? If I'm constantly having to explain myself and defend myself. And so I thought a lot about society as somebody who's who's in college and after and so on. And so for me, thinking through our place in society, social justice, then feeling sense of equality with other people around me, and therefore social justice was a really important issue. And so that's really why I focus on these questions in my research. Yeah,
because we have to begin these conversations or take them obviously to the new levels. And I love how you have taken, these 3 points, because as far as humanity is concerned, who are we using as our role models?
Yeah, exactly.
To base our thinking. I mean, who do you choose?
Yeah, and the other problem, of course, with defining human beings as a rational animal is that there are plenty of people who, we know from disability studies that, that defining human beings based on their ability to think is really problematic, because people who are not able to function on the same cognitive level as everybody else, because of whatever deficits or what have you, are they not human suddenly, right? And so, like, this question of rationality, or being a reasoning person is exactly the problem with that. Is exactly as you said, right? Who is the standard? Who is defining what's reasonable and what's rational, and who's authority, right? And what makes them authoritative? And oftentimes, these questions are dictated by elite men. In our society, oftentimes they're elite white men. But broadly speaking, I mean, in the world that I'm working on, in the medieval world, it's elite Muslim men who are free, not enslaved, right? So but in the contemporary times, it's oftentimes also still elite men, particularly white men. Yeah.
Right. Well, before we go on here, I just want to tell you that Jamila is here,
Oh, okay.
and she said, "Good luck, Ustada
Okay.
Ayubi. We are so proud of you."
Oh, thank you.
Okay, just want you to know.
Oh, that's so sweet. Thank you.
Yeah. So anybody else, please feel free to join us in our chat. You can tell us how much you like Zahra and comment and ask questions if you've read her book, or if you're just curious about something, or you are someone who you just maybe you want a little advice. Maybe you want to know, how do I express myself in this scenario? Like, how do I how do I come out of something? So 919-518-9773, or computers, that's plural, then the number 2K voice on Skype voice. You can come in there as well, and you can join us in our chat. So what are Muslim women saying?
What are Muslim women saying?
Yeah.
They're saying a lot of things and a lot of different things. So one of the things I also talk about in the book at the very, very end is this idea that we can't lump everyone together, right? So the term that I talked about last time that I was on, and I would remind us again about is intersectionality, right? So as well as just which is basically a term that explains how we are all intersectional beings. We're all not just one thing, right? So I'm not just a Muslim woman. I'm also other things. Happen to be someone of a particular heritage, and I happen to be someone of a particular socioeconomic class, and I happen to be someone from a particular national origin, a particular sexuality. So we are all so many things, and we're also, religion itself is a very interesting category too, because even though you can think about religion as being like rituals or practices and so on, there's so many things that go into being of a particular faith. And sometimes it's food, sometimes it's music, and sometimes it's there's so many aspects to religion, so many aspects to being Muslim. So I'd say when you ask the question of like Muslim, what are Muslim women saying?
Today, what are they saying?
Yeah, today, what are they saying? It's definitely, I want to emphasize that there's just like no way to centralize it, right? Like there's no unified kind of approach to being Muslim, or approach to understanding of Islam, or Islam itself is such a like Islam today in modernity is such a conglomeration of so many different things, and it varies from country to country. It varies because of social class. It varies. Your practices and your beliefs vary so much. So all of this variation and diversity. There's 1 billion Muslims plus worldwide, right? So everybody has their own understanding of Islam, and that really affects what they're going to say about their place in the world. And Muslim women also will then have very diverse views about their place in the world. And so I guess Muslim feminists, if you want to be like more particular, I would say are really a rich group of women, and Islamic feminists in particular, a very rich group of women who are not necessarily all talking to one another, so not all networked, but some are, and these are women who are networking through academia, through social media, through all kinds of, I guess, networking that there is these days, and they're working through issues of gender equality, looking at religious texts together.
Can I interrupt you a second? Who are these women? Like, who are these women to be able to speak out, speak up, and where is the Islamic man in their life that might be holding them down, and how are they not being held down? Whether it was paternal, whatever it is.
Yeah, whatever it is. So I wouldn't say that Muslim feminists are only born because of having the experience of being held down. Like, oftentimes Muslim feminists emerge because of quote unquote not being held down by their own people, but rather because of being held down by the external, right? So like anti-Muslim, or people like to use the term Islamophobia, right? Islamophobic or anti-Muslim is more accurate in my view. Anti-Muslim and oftentimes racist sort of hand in hand sentiment that sort of assume that Muslim women are subjugated, right? So that in itself is a lot of fodder for creating sort of feminist ideals, right? And so like, what do they say? So like, who are the women? I would say they're everywhere. They're like anyone can be, right? So Muslim feminists are just anyone who holds a feminist position, belief in equality, right? Gender equality, doesn't necessarily have to be a religious approach, but oftentimes can be, right? And so like, we're talking about, people in academia, students, whatever, all aspects of people in academia and students are who I encounter, but I mean, all aspects of life, all walks of life. And, from the woman at the checkout counter to university professor, like it's all diverse professions and all diverse aspects of life. But I would say that I would strongly emphasize that it's not necessarily a result of like Muslim men holding them down or like patriarchal forces that they encounter in their own family. It can be, but it's not always the case. And more often it's not the case, right? So on a worldwide global level, maybe you would say that it's like a overarching patriarchy that you encounter in society rather than any given like personal experience, it could be a personal experience, it could, but I think all societies, like our American society, are highly male dominated. And so it's belief in gender equality is something that I think is if it should be a universal thing, but
right.
But it's something that a lot of Muslim women have in common, and have in common with other women too.
No question. So it's an inside job.
Inside job.
It's an inside job. It's not just, I mean, it's anyone who has that self-realization of something. They read a book, they heard an article, they have a friend, they've gone to school, something has occurred to empower these women to speak up for other women.
Yeah, sure.
Right?
Yeah, or even speak up for themselves.
And speak up for themselves.
Absolutely.
So how are the Muslim men receiving all of this? What is happening, and what is happening? Is there a shakeup?
I think, like non-Muslim communities, you'll see the spectrum. So you'll see men who are incredibly supportive, right? Men who describe themselves as Muslim feminists as well. And they may not be all intellectuals, they may be lay people, right? So it's not all academics.
Right.
And that's a very healthy contingent. You'll see people who are sympathetic, but they don't know quite how to be an ally. You see that a lot. That's definitely also the case if I just talk about like American Muslims only, if just them, then I would say there's a lot of I guess overlaps and like similar experiences of Muslim feminists compared to like other feminists. So which is like there's strong allies, then there's like people who want to be allies but don't know how, then there's people who are, if you educate them about various things about rights and about concepts of gender, or critiques of how gender relations play out, then they want to be sympathetic once they're because they may be ignorant from before, but they learn and they want to be, then they're sympathetic, and and then there's always people who just simply will never buy it, right? Because they feel like that's perhaps not religiously sanctioned, or they may feel like we live in a male-dominated society as a whole, and so, it's benefiting them. Why change that? Or they're just so used to it, right? I mean, all of us are very much conditioned, men, women, non-gender binary individuals as well. Like, everybody's very much conditioned to live in a patriarchal society. And so when we talk about gender equality, oftentimes we're like, yeah, that sounds great, but like, what does that actually look like, right? And I think Muslim community struggles with that, but but as do other religious communities, and non-religious communities as well.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. So in your classes, what would be like your religion 101 or your Islam 101 or your feminist 101 or your gender equality 101? Where would you be starting? What would be the first question or the first conversation?
Yeah, the first conversation in any class that I've taught, whether it's a gender and Islam class or a Muslim feminism class or a religious studies, introduction to religious studies class, the very first conversation that we have actually is defining what is the difference between religion and culture. And it's a trick question, because at the end of the class, at the end of the discussion, the students all raise their hand and they say, wow, there is no difference. Because what we do is I talk about religion, and I say, okay, let's brainstorm all of these ideas about what is religion? What comes to mind when we talk about religion? And then they say things like, oh, when we talk about religion, we talk about religious texts. We can talk about rituals and art and music and food and ideas about God and ideas and laws and and all sorts of things. When we talk about religion, what is religion? What is the stuff of religion, right? And then we talk about what's the stuff of culture, right? What is culture? What defines culture? What is our culture? Like, what are the things that we talk about when we talk about culture? And oftentimes, like, the students very quickly recognize that those things are the same, right? So like rituals and art and music and food and the way we dress or the way we whatever. So much is culture. And so the boundary between where religion ends and culture begins, or where culture ends and religion begins, is really, really, really messy. And the point of doing that for me, for my courses, is to, from day one, to talk about how there are so many several factors at play in what makes, whether, if it's a class on Muslim women, if it's a class on Muslim feminism, or if it's a class on gender and Islam, or if it's a class on just religion and gender broadly speaking, what are the things that caught that the impulses that are religious versus the impulses that are cultural? They're kind of confusing, and they're kind of confusing as to which one is which, right? And that's on purpose, because from the get-go, when you recognize that, then you realize that there is a kind of, not necessarily universal in terms of like specific life experiences, but there is a universal idea about, a common idea about what motivates human behavior, or what motivates people from religious perspectives, may in fact not necessarily be because of religion. It may not be because of culture. It may be a combination of both. And so it allows us to not box people in, right? Not think that somebody's religion is at fault for why they're acting or being a certain way. There's many other factors, right? Or religion is responsible. It's not that religion is responsible for everything, or that culture is responsible for everything. That particularly nowadays, so much of these different epistemologies or sources of knowledge are actually intertwined. That is unsettling for a lot of students, but in a way it's actually settling too, because then they feel like, okay, I can't actually stereotype, about Muslim women's experiences, or can't really stereotype about what this big giant thing called Islam says. I mean, as if like Islam's a person, right? As what Islam says about women or men, or gender and so on. So then that opens up the possibilities, right? If you can't stereotype, because that behaviors, actions that are religious are not necessarily motivated by only religion, or that what comprises and what makes up religion is like a whole conglomeration of different things, then you sort of open your mind as to like what are the kinds of things that what actually is there, what can we say, what are the things that we need to learn. So that's what we do on day one. That's the opening that's the opening discussion.
And when we realize the things that we can learn, then are you saying that then the students feel more empowered themselves to listen?
Yes, absolutely. When we realize that there are so many things that we can learn, because those categories of what's only religion, what's only culture, what's only gender, when they break down, then you're open. Then it's it's a lot of deconstructive work, but then you sort of construct it again, construct ideas about how you approach difference, people who are different from yourself. How do you learn about them?
So with religion, and correct me if I'm wrong, with religion, I see religion as something that's somewhat etched in stone. And then culture, though, we're making kind of as we go.
Yeah, no, it's a really, really great way of thinking about it. I would say that culture, yes, is we're making it the way we go, but religion too. So we like to think about religion as being something that is created from divine origin or whatever, when someone believes in divine origin. And it comes down, perhaps the religion has prophets, perhaps there's some other medium, comes to human beings, and it's static and it's unchanging. But religion itself changes over time, and that's one of the things that being a historian of religion actually helps to sort of illuminate, is that ideas about religion, very fundamental ideas, like ideas about how human beings think about a god or gods, or how human beings think about what religion says about what is normal for human relations, or for gender relations, or slavery, or all of these different issues that have come up over human history, and if you track these particular themes, right, you see that ideas about what quote unquote religion says, or Islam says, right, and I'm saying, putting that in quotes, because it's not like Islam's a person, or like like it's not like it's one thing, right? It's multiple sources.
Right, we have to interpret. I mean, who's ever interpreting it is interpreting it.
Exactly. And so the interpreters really matter. The lens through which you are looking at religious sources, those lenses are what sort of create what is religious, right? And so your lens of how you're looking at religious texts and religious sources and religious ideas and people and so on, figures, they change with who you are. So like if you happen to be a woman who's reading a text, you may perhaps think of it in a different way than say you're a woman in the particular century of a particular race. You may be seeing it different from a woman who is of a different cultural background, racial background, or whatever, right? So like your life experiences based on who you are they color how you approach religious ideas. And sure, there's a lot of commonalities, right? And there's a lot of common factors, but ultimately what you argue, what somebody argues, or what historically scholars have argued is a religious thing, has actually, it's a product of a historical context.
Mhm. So, as a scholar
Mm-hmm.
and as a historian, as a professor of religion, so
Mm-hmm.
what is Islam? I mean, how do you look at Islam? And how is Islam one of the things that we kind of read into some of your information was um, it's a model for it's a model for I mean all of this is a model for how we all can live.
Mm-hmm.
So what is the perception and the misperception, the misconcepts? What is that, and how can you bring that together for us? Because that's a lot of questions in one.
Yeah, it's a huge topic in itself, but I would say that if you, I would definitely, when we talk about like sort of universals and so on and so forth, I would definitely put Islam in context, in a historical context of like it emerged in a particular time, um, with the historical with historical connections to religions that came before it. So we're all familiar with Judaism and Christianity, but also there were many other monotheistic Semitic religions that sort of fell away historically. And Islam emerges in that time period, in late antiquity, and many ideas are shared across these monotheistic religions. Um, but but even then, I mean, I would say, if you want to talk about what Islam is and isn't, you're gonna get many answers depending on who's answering the question.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like as a scholar of Islam, it's my job to sort of talk about how, not necessarily to say this is Islam and this is not Islam, but rather to say, look at all of these different and interesting approaches to how people define it. Because there's that richness, all of it together comprises a religious tradition, right? And so there isn't a singular answer, a singular definition. But what you can say is that there are people who are approaching similar sorts of origins and original stories and original texts, right? Whether it's the Prophet Muhammad and the Quran and so on, and they're approaching it the way that they want to.
So can we get personal?
Way that they want to.
Can we get personal? For you, what is it about Islam? Like, what is it that warms you up?
What is it that
Yeah, what is it that, that you love?
What do I love about the tradition?
Yeah.
There's what's not to love.
Okay,
really.
good answer.
Yeah, honestly, what's not to love? I mean, it's really a rich tradition, and I like the richness of it. And maybe that's like a cop out of an answer. But there's a lot of diversity. It's a global religion. As I said, there's 1 billion Muslims worldwide, and I enjoy the fact that there is that multiplicity, and that being Muslim is actually a kind of like and maybe this is a historian's answer. It's like a pre-modern kind of answer, but there's like a passport. It's being Muslim is kind of like having a passport to and access to a rich tradition that you can sort of study and learn, and it's diverse, and you don't have to be stuck in a particular place at a particular time per se. And I guess that is a historian's sort of answer, or a scholar's sort of answer, a scholarly answer. But I like that. I like that there is a diverse heritage to draw on when it comes to Muslim traditions, when it comes to Muslim texts, Muslim practices, and so on.
Okay, well, I have another question, but I'm not. There's a question on the chat, and I'm not going to read it.
Okay.
Mukhtar is a comment question.
Mm.
Thank you for a great discussion. Language has semantically forged to mean certain things for certain people.
Mhm.
I'm thinking about the meaning of the harem, as Fatima Mernisi tried to explore in her book Shahrazad Goes West. How do we reopen this dictionary to include things we need to learn and things we need to unlearn for our friends and students?
Language and semantics. That's something that is really, really difficult to get people to think through, because I mean, I'm not a linguist, and I'm not a scholar of Arabic or anything like that, but we do in religious studies and Islamic studies as a subfield within it, we do debate semantics a lot. Like, what are we going to call this, and what are we going to call that? And Mukhtar is asking about the harem, and this concept of the harem as being, so the harem is that's a toughie, because when I use the word harem in English, it means something very, very particular, like very exotic, and very exotic and different and very sexualized, because it's this idea that Muslim women are cloistered and they're only for and exist only for the sexual pleasure of men in particular, and that there are multiple women that belong to one man and things like that. And so that being the American or even like European sort of imagination of what a harem is, it's problematic, because that is a kind of that contributes to this idea of Muslim women's like unquestioned subjugation, and it's sort of and exoticization and so on and so forth. But the historical concept of it is really this pre-modern gender segregation that was in fact an ideal and not necessarily perfect in practice. So if the so-called harem, right, was described as like the inner sanctum of a home, haram, the word comes from haram, and haram basically is like places where you can sort of sanctify it, right? So purity, draw a circle around the places that is pure. And so if the haram is like the inner sanctum of a home, sort of historically speaking, then that's, the idea was in pre-modern times is that and up until I guess colonialism, for many Muslim countries, the harem was considered to be like the inner sanctum of a home. And the inner sanctum of a home was traditionally where women live and where they make their home and protect the home. It's sort of like, if you want to think about like a corollary would be, or like a good comparison would be like, in Victorian times or so on, like the protection of the inner sanctum of the home was like the domestic realm was the woman's realm. And so, that in itself has really broken down because of, women's education and women working and so on. But also historically, it's not perfect, right? So even in my book, I talk about how gender segregation was kind of an ideal, and for the elite Muslim male scholarly establishment, but it was not necessarily a reality. Like women and men mixed everywhere. They mixed in the mosque. They mixed in the marketplace. They mixed at court. In times where royal courts were political centers, and they mixed everywhere, right? They mixed in the home as well. And so the perfect harem, as it were, it was not really ever in existence per se. But sure, people did still consider the inner sanctum of the home to be the woman's realm. And so, as I was saying, in contemporary times, just historical social reality rather breaks that idea down even further, in that outside of the home is not gender segregated, but also inside of the home is not gender segregated also, only because men are in fact making homes as well, right? So it's this coming back to that idea about masculinity and sort of breaking down the idea of what is an exclusive Islamic masculinity, that men are also part of making the home. And so and another I guess what the person who wrote in the chat, Mokhtar, what he was asking about in terms of like, how can we break down or get to a truer concept of the harem that is not so about gender segregation per se. And it's, in my view, it's not just a language or semantic issue, but rather an issue of accounting for experience. So experience is the way to get at breaking down this idea about the harem, right? So like women's experience in working and living and being, and men's experiences of working and living and being in outside the home, inside the home, and so on. That I think would account for breaking down this idea of a harem.
We need an urban dictionary. A new dictionary. I mean, because a lot of times I look up words too. I mean, and what was, and then there's this whole new philosophical approach, definition to a word, and it completely changes it, the complete concept. I do want to just ask you quickly, when we talked about diversity, of Islamic diversity, how is that different than any other religion? How is that different? The diversity that you see in Islam, how is that different than any other religion, or is it?
It's different in that we're talking truly about a global transnational tradition. So that's maybe it's more akin to Christianity in that way, because Christians are also like that, just sheer number and volume wise, very similar. But also in terms of where we're talking about, right? So yes, there are Muslims who live all over the world, and Muslims in the United States and Europe are increasing in numbers. It's I think Islam is still the largest growing religion within the United States, if I'm not mistaken. But in terms of where we're talking about, so people often think about the Middle East as being the place where Islam was born, and so therefore they think of Muslims as being Middle Eastern only.
Right.
But the largest Muslim country in the world, population-wise, is Indonesia. The next largest Muslim country in the world, Muslim countries, in the world, are in South Asia, right? So like, I don't know exactly the ranking because off the top of my head I forget, but Indonesia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and are in the top 5, I believe. And then you'll have, I think, Egypt or a couple of other Middle Eastern countries, if I'm not mistaken. But all of this is to say that a professor of mine used to say this a lot, is that if you draw a median line of where Muslims are on a map, where the median population of Muslims in the world are located, then the line is not in the Middle East, but rather falls somewhere in Karachi, Pakistan, right, where it's like majority of Muslims of the world, of the billion, numerically live in South Asia and East Asia, or Southeast Asia rather.
Okay.
So in terms of like the diversity, what's different, I would say, is location, perhaps.
Okay.
Particulars, yeah. But
Okay.
also millions of Muslims that are African, and and so in terms of like who we think of as Muslims, that's something that needs to also break down.
And I know that there's tons and tons more to talk about. We haven't even scratched the surface, but just hold up your book and tell everybody where they can get it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the book is called Gendered Morality, Classical Islamic Ethics of the Self, Family, and Society. It's published by Columbia University Press. And you can go to their own website and use CUP30 as the discount. Always, it's like 30% off or something. But you could also get it from like wherever books are sold. So
that's a good thing.
Yes.
That's a good thing. So hold on one second. So here is, you have my thing? My books? Okay.
Oh,
so,
that's great. Yeah.
Yeah. So here's my menu. In just one afternoon, listening to the hearts of men, then twins and millennials, and soon opioid addiction. And I'm working on some more, but those will, the first 3 up on Amazon, then opioid would hopefully be up in the next few months. So let me ask you something. We only have a few moments. What is your dream?
What is my dream? To get through the day.
Me too. Me too.
I would say to educate as a professor, educate I guess a generation of students who are aware of their world and their place in the world and their goals for being global citizens. I mean, I guess that's really what I'm working towards right now, and hoping that will lead to positive change.
How's it look?
The students are great. They're I always think investing in students is a really wonderful thing to do, because they go out in the world, and if they don't necessarily follow in your footsteps, that's fine, as long as they have certain takeaways from the things that you've taught in class. And if they take away even what we talked about just on the show, right, the idea that there's a whole diversity of experience and a whole diversity of ideas that go into being Muslim or of a particular religious tradition, and that Muslim feminists are people who are in very universal ways thinking about how to achieve justice and gender equality, sort of broadly speaking, then that's a really great takeaway.
Mm-hmm. And it's all broad, isn't it? One of my takeaways is
specific and technical, but yeah.
One of my takeaways from today is that it isn't just this or just that I have the right, as everyone else does, to realize it's more than just one way of thinking. And that, I think, is a big deal. It sounds so simple, right? It sounds so simple, but it's not just what I've heard. It's more than that. So, do you have a question? Okay. So, Zahra, you've been wonderful.
Thank you.
Is there anything, a closing remark that you want to make?
No, other than saying that I hope that people think very deeply about this question of what defines our humanity, and try their best to open the idea of who they can consider to be part of our human family in the most open ways possible, in the way that's responsible and not doing harm to the other person, not utilizing other people in their ethics and their ethical approaches.
Well, and if anybody who's ever been listening today, you have been witness to someone who's actually living this, right? So, Zahra, you're doing it. Right?
Oh, please, thank you.
You're very welcome.
I would certainly hope so. I mean, we're all works in progress.
We are all works in progress, no question. So thank you so much for being here today. And thank you for everyone that's been on the chat and asked questions. We love it. Thanks for everyone being out there and listening and engaging and just taking this into your heart. And Amnon, as always, thank you so much. Happy Thanksgiving to those of you I haven't wished that to before. And I'll see you soon. Bye. Bye.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. If you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section at nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by Telestream's Wirecast software, StreamingGear.com, Carolina Apparel, and DeltaForce.net.